So I want to take a minute to welcome everyone to today's presentation. And unfortunately, my co-presenter, Steve Nettles, cannot be here with us today. But I'm going to begin by giving a bit of background about myself and about my team and what we do here. So my background is in social psychology with an emphasis in quantitative research methods. But despite that, a lot of my research experience is in education, with topics as varied as looking at the impact of humor in the classroom on students' learning, all the way to evaluating chiropractic degree programs for effectiveness. So it really transitions well to what I do at Ashford. And I've been here for about 3.5 years. And to give you a bit of background on my team, which is the Office of Institutional Effectiveness, what we do typically falls into 2 categories. So examining what factors predict whether students will be successful or struggle at Ashford University, and then also testing policies or programs to examine how they impact the success of our students. And today's presentation falls in the latter of those 2 categories. This presentation is titled, "The Impact of Adding Students to Courses After the First Day," which is commonly referred to as backfilling students as well. So what we're going to be doing in this presentation is we're going to be comparing those students who were added to courses after they'd already begun. So these are students where the class already had their first day, and then they're being added to the class. We're going to compare those to students who were not added after the class started already. And we had been contacted with this question because there was a lot of discussion on the impact of backfilling students. And some people were thinking that backfilling students could be something that's positive, that these students are really go-getters, they're eager to start a class even though it started already. But on the other hand, it's possible that these students who are being backfilled may be those students who are struggling, and then starting the class later puts them at more of a disadvantage. And so we really conducted this study to resolve that question. And we were requested to look at 5 classes in particular. I have them up on this slide: ENG 121 and 122, Math 221 and 222, and then Communications 200, which if you look at these classes, a lot of them are common classes that a lot of our Ashford University students take. And so when we compare these students who are backfilled to students who are not backfilled, we're going to examine how they differ on a number of key metrics, from looking at course outcomes like course GPA, completion rate, pass rate, persistence, so are they currently an active student at Ashford, yes or no, as well as time to withdrawal among those students who are not currently active, so those students who have withdrawn, how long does it take them to drop out. We will also examine differences in student success score, which is a measure which estimates students' likelihood of being retained in the first year, and it pulls a lot of different factors together which influence student success. Things like, does the student have financial support? Has the student had previous college experience? To see how likely a student will retain, or if not, maybe that student may need some additional support. So we're going to look at that to see, are backfilled students at a higher risk of dropping out than those who are not backfilled? So to begin, is being backfilled a common practice? And what we see in these 5 classes is it's not particularly common. So if you look at the right side of this table, you can see that less than 1% of students in each of these classes is backfilled. So right now it's not particularly common, but it's still important to look at, because if it is something that maybe is beneficial for students or a practice that a lot of our go-getters do, we may want to expand this practice. When we look at our first outcome, which is the course GPA, what we're doing is we're looking at each course separately, and we're comparing the course GPAs on a scale of 0 to 4 points among backfilled students and not backfilled students. And if we look at this course by course, starting with English 121, we tend to see that backfilled students have lower GPAs than students who are not backfilled. And then if we follow along, we see this pattern with ENG 121, ENG 122, Math 221, and Communications 200. But when we look at Math 222, although it looks like there's a slight difference, this is not a statistical difference. So we just treat it like there's no difference at all there. So in general, course GPAs are lower for students who are backfilled. When we look at the next outcome of interest, which is course pass rate, we see that same pattern where we see that generally backfilled students tend to have a lower course pass rate than those students who were not backfilled in each individual course. Again, with Math 222, we're not seeing a statistical difference there. When we move on to persistence, which is among these students, what percent of them are still currently active, and we compare students who are backfilled to students who were not backfilled, we see, again, this same pattern. It's pretty consistent where we're seeing backfilled students persisting at a lower rate than students who were not backfilled. And again, this is a statistically significant difference for all courses except for Math 222. By now you're probably wondering, well, what's so special about Math 222 that this effect is happening in the other courses we're examining, but not this one? And while I can't answer that for sure, my hunch is that when we look at the course sequencing, Math 222 tends to be one of the later courses that students complete, whereas courses like English 121 and English 122 tend to be earlier in that course sequence. It's possible that when a student is being backfilled, that the impact of that is more amplified if you're newer to your college education experience and you're still navigating the waters of higher education and getting into your rhythm for studying. Whereas by the time students take Math 222, they may be relatively set in their rhythm and pattern of online education. And something like being backfilled into a class and starting it after the first day may not have as big of an impact on those students. Next, when we look at course completion rate, so the percent of students who are finishing these courses, we see that backfilled students are performing more poorly than not backfilled students, specifically for English 121 and English 122. So these effects are not statistically different for the other three courses, so we're not going to focus on that. Last, when we look at those students who've withdrawn, who are no longer active at Ashford University, we look at the average number of weeks till withdrawal or weeks to drop out. And again, we're seeing that backfilled students are withdrawing more quickly than students who are not backfilled. But as we saw with the earlier slide, we're seeing this specifically with the two English classes, ENG 121 and ENG 122. We're not seeing statistically significant differences for the other three courses. So my thoughts for why this could be happening specifically for ENG 121 and 122 kind of tie into what we saw earlier with Math 222. It's possible that this impact of being backfilled is more amplified for students who are earlier on in their college experience and who are still kind of navigating college and the way that they learn online. And since ENG 121 and 122 are relatively early courses in the sequence, it could be that this process of backfilling could have more of a detrimental impact for those courses. Another factor that could be impacting things is that it's possible that our high-risk students, by the time they've reached Math 222, if they're going to drop out of the institution, they may have already withdrawn. But it's possible that they're still kind of chugging along in English 121 and 122, which suggests that backfilling may not be the ideal support measure for those students. So what we've seen so far is that when we look at student progression and course success, backfilled students generally tend to do more poorly than not backfilled students. That's kind of the big picture of what we're seeing here. But it's possible that there's more to this than meets the eye, that there's other factors that are contributing to the fact that backfilled students seem to be struggling. And specifically what we're going to look at is student success scores, so their likelihood of being retained at 1 year. So if you recall from the beginning of the presentation, this is a measure that looks at a student's likelihood of being retained at Ashford University. And this figure is a bit complicated to understand at first glance, so I'm going to back up and I'm going to take a minute to walk you through what you're seeing here and orient you to this figure. So when we get those student success scores, those measures of a student's likelihood of retaining at Ashford, what we did is we divided them into 10 equal groups among our Ashford student population. So what we should be seeing here is group 1. If you look at that figure, that lowest probability of retention group, that's the 10% of students with the lowest probability of retention. And then group 2 is the next highest 10%, all the way to group 10, which is the 10% of students with the highest probability of retention. So in our general population, there should be 10% of students in each of these groups because we created 10 equal groups. And ideally what we want to see if it's a normal population is exactly that, where we've got 10% in each group. And because of that, I drew a line at the 10% mark, so we can use that as an indicator. So anytime we see a bar in this bar graph that's above or below that 10% line, we know that they differ from the normal population in that way. So starting off, when we look at those dark purple lines that represent the not backfilled students, if we look at this figure, we see every purple bar matches that 10%. So this indicates that this is a normal population in terms of their likelihood of retention. So as expected, we've got about 10% in each of these groups. So 10% in the 10% lowest likelihood of retaining, 10% in the highest likelihood of retaining. But now when we turn to the yellow bars, those backfilled students, we see that that's not the case. When we look at group 1, which is that lowest probability of retaining, we see that 12% instead of 10% of backfilled students fall into that group. So, and indeed, if we look at the groups 1 through 4, which are those lower probability of retention groups, we're seeing that a higher proportion of backfilled students than average is seen in there. So that indicates that our backfilled students are less likely to be retained than our general population. Then when we turn to the other end of the graph, we look at numbers 8, 9, and 10. These are the 3 groups with the highest likelihood of retention. So when we look at those yellow bars, those backfilled students, these groups, we're seeing that it's actually less than 10%. So of those students who we think would be really likely to retain, we're seeing less than the average amount. We're seeing less than 10% in those groups. So really what we're seeing here is backfilled students are those students who tend to be higher risk. So it's possible that these students are already the students who are struggling, and that may be why they were backfilled in the first place. Maybe they had to change courses, maybe they had to drop a course, and that could be why they were backfilled. So what we're really seeing here is kind of a chicken and the egg factor. So when we look at course outcomes, we're seeing that backfilled students are performing more poorly than those students who are not backfilled. But it's unclear to us, is it because of the process of backfilling and starting a class late actually puts you at a disadvantage? Or is it due to the fact that the backfilled students are more likely to struggle to begin with? And in a case like this, I think that regardless of which one is the driving force behind it, the effect is still the same, which is that when students are backfilled, they do tend to struggle more. So that's something that is important to keep in mind. And it's an indicator that we really do want to keep the backfills to a minimum and really look at students and see if they feel like they will be able to succeed in the class if they're added to the class after it has already begun. And one of the other things that I want to leave you with and put out for food for thought is that when we look at our policies and procedures that we have in place, we often tend to think in terms of how will our policies help students? How will they hurt students? Or how will this student perform? But we rarely focus on the intersection of our policies with subpopulations. And we need to keep in mind that some policies may disproportionately affect high-risk students or low-risk students, and we need to keep that in mind when designing policies to make sure that we're adequately supporting those students that need support. So I want to thank you for listening, and I would love to hear your impressions and thoughts in the QA and comment section. Thank you.